Good morning and happy Sabbath, Covenant Advent Church. And good morning and happy Sabbath to those of you who've joined online. Welcome to our Sabbath School study this morning, and I pray that you'll be richly blessed. We'll go right into our opening hymn, and we will turn to hymn number 444. Hymn number 444. I'm a pilgrim and I'm a stranger. Hymn number 444. And when it is found, I'll ask that you kindly stand, as once again this will be our opening hymn, number 444. Number 444. Reverently kneel for our opening prayer. Dear kind, merciful Father, Lord, thank you for waking us up this morning and allowing us to see this Sabbath day. And I thank you, Lord, for allowing us to assemble here and online to worship Thee in spirit and in truth. Lord, as we just sang the song, the hymn, we're strangers and we're pilgrims. We can tarry but a night. Let us, Lord, take these words to our hearts, that we may not be caught up with the things around us to the point where they would distract us from preparing our hearts and our minds to be ready for Thee when You come. These are many blessings I ask in Your Son's name. Amen. Our scripture this morning will be coming from Romans chapter 13, verses 7 and 8. Romans chapter 13, verse 7 and 8. Romans chapter 13, verse 7 and 8. And I'll read in your hearing. It reads, "Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Owe no man anything, but to love one another. For he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law." Herein endeth the reading of God's word. So this quarter, we're studying stewardship. And the lesson this morning is a lesson that I think all of us can gain encouragement and admonition and something that we can all identify with, and it is debt. Specifically, the lesson is entitled this morning, Debt, a Daily Decision. And it's true, we do make a daily decision with debt because each decision we make every day will decide whether we're setting our feet into debt or helping ourselves get out of debt or helping us to, even if we don't have debt, to waste the resources that we have. And we all know that it's God that gives us strength to make a living. But what we sometimes forget is that the living that we make is not just for the mere fact of paying bills or buying things that we would like to have, but it's also to support His work and support the work of the gospel. So for our opening reading, I'd like to share from Adventist Home. I thought that was very, very interesting that even during that time, that debt was such a big issue, and that Sister White had very practical advice to people who are in debt and to people to avoid being indebted. So once again, this reading is coming from Adventist Home. And I'm going to skip around to a few different excerpts, but basically they're in between pages 374 and 384. So just a few excerpts from Adventist Home. And it reads, "Many, very many, have not so educated themselves that they can keep their expenditures within the limit of their income. They do not learn to adapt themselves to circumstances, and they borrow and borrow again and again and become overwhelmed in debt, and consequently they become discouraged and disheartened. Keep a record of expenditures. Habits of self-indulgence or a want of tact and skill on the part of wife and mother may be a constant drain upon the treasury, and yet that mother may think she is doing her best because she has never been taught to restrict her wants or the wants of her children, and has never acquired skill and tact in household matters. Hence, one family may require for its support twice the amount that would suffice for another family of the same size. All should learn how to keep accounts. Some neglect this work as non-essential, but this is wrong. All expenses should be accurately stated." But then, and it goes on to say, "The Lord has been pleased to present before me the evils which result from spendthrift habits, that I might admonish parents to teach their children strict economy. Teach them that money spent for that which they do not need is perverted from its proper use. If you have extravagant habits, cut them away from your life at once. Unless you do this, you will be bankrupt for eternity. Habits of economy, industry, and sobriety are a better portion for your children than a rich dowry." I thought that was a very telling comment, that teaching children to economize, be industrious, and sober in their handling of money is better than giving them a rich dowry or gifting them with a lot of money when they marry. "We are pilgrims and strangers on the earth. Let us not spend our means in gratifying desires that God would have us repress. Let us fitly represent our faith by restricting our wants. When tempted to needless spending, when you are tempted to spend money for knickknacks, you should remember the self-denial and self-sacrifice that Christ endured to save fallen man. Our children should be taught to exercise self-denial and self-control. The reason so many ministers feel that they have a hard time in financial matters is that they do not bind about their tastes, their appetites, and inclinations. The reason so many men become bankrupt and dishonestly appropriate means is because they seek to gratify the extravagant tastes of their wives and children. How careful should fathers and mothers be to teach economy by precept and example to their children? I wish I could impress on every mind the grievous sinfulness of wasting the Lord's money on fancied wants. The expenditure of sums that look small may start a train of circumstances that will reach into eternity. When the judgment shall sit and the books are open, the losing side will be presented to your view.
the good that you might have done with the accumulated might and the larger sums that were used for wholly selfish purposes. Waste not your pennies and your shillings in purchasing unnecessary things. You may think these little sums do not amount to much, but these many littles will prove a great whole. If we could, we would plead for the means that is spent in needless things, in dress and selfish indulgence. Poverty in every shape is on every hand, and God has made it our duty to relieve suffering humanity in every way possible. The Lord would have his people thoughtful and caretaking. He would have them study economy in everything and waste nothing. The amount daily spent in needless things, with the thought, it is only a nickel, it is only a dime, seems very little, but multiply these littles by the days of the year, and as the years go by, the array of figures will seem almost incredible. It is not best to pretend to be rich or anything above what we are, humble followers of the meek and lowly Savior. We are not to feel disturbed if our neighbors build and furnish their houses in a manner that we are not authorized to follow. How must Jesus look upon our selfish provision for the indulgence of appetite to please our guests or to gratify our own inclination? It is a snare to us to aim at making a display or to allow our children under our control to do so. Very grave words for how we as Christians should manage the means that the Lord gives us. So at this time, we will kneel as we have our prayer for our teachers, and then we'll separate for our classes. Dear Heavenly Father, once again we bow before Thee, thankful, Lord, that You have allowed us this day, and thankful, Lord, for allowing us to be in Thy presence. I ask You to please be with the teachers this morning. May You bless them and give them a double portion of Your Spirit. And I ask that You might be with all of us here and online, that the words we hear this morning will stir us, Lord, to action if there's a need for that, or will encourage us to do the things that we know we ought to do. I ask You to continue to keep us in Thy care. In Jesus' name, amen. I'll now turn the Sabbath School class over to Elder Jose Otero.
Welcome again to today's lesson. We're up to lesson 11, entitled Debt, a Daily Decision. A daily decision. Sometimes people would say it's a nighttime decision too, because we can shop 24 hours a day. But a debt, society is set up for us to spend and not to save. And if you're well aware, American society do not save. There are other societies that do save. I believe the Chinese are known for savings, and they're what you call penny pinchers, right? Penny pinchers. And I think those are type of people that don't spend on anything that's not needed. But debt. What is debt? Debt is something that has become part of our lives, part of our daily living. Nations are in debt. Sometimes they have to go bankrupt. Companies go in debt and they go bankrupt also. And so that means that families also go bankrupt. They're too much in debt. And individuals as well. Many things lead us into debt. It could be anything from a car loan to student loans, business loans, everything loan. And of course, when somebody loans you money, it's for you to spend it. It's not for you to save it. Otherwise, you can do that yourself, right? No? But this whole concept of buy now and pay later has just become a way of living. And so it almost seems like impossible for someone to get out of debt. It's so painless to use a card and just hear the sound, right? As opposed to you actually taking out the bills and paying with bills. It's less painful. And so it's so much easier to get in debt. But debt, how should we handle that? And how does it influence us? When every day we're so much under pressure to spend money. We know that a lot of what goes on in society has to do with that. Divorces, right? And broken relationship, suicides. Many people commit suicide because of that. Failed businesses, right? The leaders of the business cannot manage the money correctly. So with that goes down the business, and with that other people's jobs. And the gospel, how does that affect the gospel? If everybody in the church was not in debt, think about that. How would the church function? Would it be different? Would we have a building by now if everybody was debt free? Perhaps maybe, right? But of course, we know that God's people have to be careful as to how they handle the money, because God's people are different from the people of the world, because the people of the world do not pay tithe. 10%, I believe, goes out anyway, right? Because they do other things. You know, when you don't worship God, you're worshiping something else. And sometimes that thing that you worship does take money. It could be that boat. It could be the stadium. It could be that concert. But 10% will go out. But God's people does something special with that 10% in offerings. It sustains workers. And so the more debt we're in, what happens to the tithes and offerings? Okay? So we also have another debt according to Romans 13:7-8, right? We have to meet our obligations as far as love and honor, right? To each other and to God. And so that plays a big role in our spiritual life, and also how we function at work and also at the home. And so depending upon how things are managed with the material possessions that God has given us, it would affect our spiritual life, and it will affect every aspect of our life. Now, Sunday's lesson, borrowing and spending. Is it a sin to borrow? Is it, and do we need to be taught how to spend? Some people would say no, because you give somebody money and they just spend it. No cost needed, right? But we do need to know how to, when to borrow and when to spend. And normally I would say try never to borrow. But there are occasions sometimes where we need to borrow depending on the situation. In Deuteronomy 28:12. Deuteronomy 8:12 says, "For the Lord shall open up thee his good treasure, the heaven to give the rain unto thy land in his season, and to bless all the work of thy hand. And thou shalt lend unto many nations, and thou shalt not borrow." So borrowing becomes a big deal. Did I give you the right text? I see some frowns. Yeah, I didn't say 28:12, Deuteronomy. I said everything else except 28. All right. 28:12, Deuteronomy. "The Lord shall open unto thee his good treasure, the heaven to give the rain unto thy land in his season, and to bless all the work of thy hand. And thou shalt lend unto many nations, and thou shalt not borrow." Borrow. You know, borrowing is something else. If you need money, you go to the bank, and the bank just charges so much interest. And the same thing with credit cards. Everybody has felt the credit card late fees thing, and also the high interest rates. And the banks are no better sometimes. Sometimes you go to the bank and you say, wait a minute, credit cards are better as far as the interest rate. But borrowing and spending, what are the complications of borrowing? When is it okay to borrow, and when is it not okay to borrow? Or is it okay to borrow at all? And what about spending? Once you have the money, what are you going to spend it on? Should you spend it on whatever you want to borrow? Sometimes you say, well, a business is a good thing to do, right? But what kind of business are you doing? And is it going to give you the returns you need in order to pay back the bank? I remember there was this pastor that said that they made a car loan and the interest rate was so high. And what the father-in-law said, the father-in-law gave them money to them, they paid off the loan, and then they paid back the father-in-law. And they knocked out a couple of thousands of dollars. But not everybody is willing to do that. You're going to have to pay back these interest rates. And so when we come to certain situations, we know that if you don't have the seed money to start something, it's very, very difficult to start something. It could be a business, it could be a loan for a church building. School loans are big. And you know you can't file for bankruptcy when you have a school loan. You have to pay back the government. They don't want to hear the excuse that you have no money. You were going to have a comment?
I think your original question was, is it wrong to borrow?
Is it wrong to borrow? Is it okay to borrow?
Or is it okay to borrow? I would say it's not wrong to borrow money as long as, number one, you're borrowing it for a legitimate purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And number two, that whatever you're borrowing, you will be able to pay it back.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, I'm reminded of a sermon that Brother Green preached, and some of the things that the pastor said. If you're borrowing money for education,
Mm-hmm.
that's not a bad thing, because that will position you to find a job. But then you also have to consider the amount of money you're borrowing and the return on the investment. So if you're borrowing $100,000, $200,000
Mm-hmm.
to be a social worker, you're not going to be able to pay back that debt, because social workers don't make enough money to pay back that kind of debt.
Unless you have a master's.
And even then you're not
still,
going to be able to pay back
yeah,
that debt.
yeah.
But if you're borrowing $100,000 and you're going to become a doctor, an attorney, an engineer, you do have the earning capacity to pay back the debt. Now, is it wise to borrow that amount of money? No, especially if you could get a comparable education at a school where you're going to pay less than that. But again, you have to weigh the purpose for the money that's being borrowed, and then whether or not you'll be able to receive a return large enough that will allow you to pay off the debt that you incurred to achieve that goal.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
As far as borrowing, I think you can borrow, but at the same time, before you get into borrowing, you have to be disciplined. Because if you are undisciplined as far as spending,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to be undisciplined when you borrow.
Mm-hmm.
So, because I think that there's a lot of, if you can utilize borrowing effectively, it's advantageous to you.
Mm-hmm.
And for example, like a lot of the credit card companies now offer 0% financing for 12 months, 18 months, 24 months. And if you have discipline in borrowing, you could utilize that to your advantage and purchase something at a 0% interest rate. So use other people's money to make your purchase and then go paying it off, so that within the year you have utilized someone else's money to purchase whatever you may have need of, not what you want, but what you have a need of, and utilize that and pay it off without incurring any interest charges. But like I said it from the beginning, if you're not disciplined, there are many people that have done stuff like that, and then at the end of the year, they've accumulated all of that interest charges, and it ends up costing them much more, because now they've borrowed. Let's say, for example, they bought an item that cost $1,000, and then they incurred interest charges for a whole year on those $1,000. And now they're going to pay like $1,250 on top of whatever they're going to be paying also on a monthly basis. So if you're going to borrow, you have to have discipline also in borrowing.
Yeah. Some people go into business and it might not be the best thing, because there's so many things that have to come together for a business to succeed. It takes more than just money and a good business plan. You got to have the people in place. And on top of that, for 3 to 5 years, the hours that it takes to run a business and to make it successful, it's quite an accomplishment if it could be done. A business is not good for everyone, and sometimes it's not good at all for people to do, especially if that's not their talent. And a student loan is a good thing, but I've heard of people who go into medical school and 2 years in they say, well, I want to be a banker, or I want to be a carpenter. So it's a tricky thing. I think if you're going to borrow for something that is your talent, that you know you can do it, that you love to do, that you will do it for free. Because what happens when we borrow and we owe, it's really you're under bondage. And it could drive people to despair and discouragement. And that's why God emphasizes, with this borrowing issue. If you borrow, you're responsible, like the axe head that fell into the water. It was borrowed. So that means that you're using with permission, but you're responsible to give it back. And so when we borrow, we have to always think that the Bible calls those who don't give back wicked. Like in Psalms 37:21, the wicked don't pay back. And borrowing could be a curse if it's not done in accordance to God's will. We have to be cooperators with God in all things. And when it comes to paying back, we really have to labor with our hands. Sometimes people owe so much that they do illegal activity just to pay back that loan. Right? They say, I will only do this for this one time, and I'll get out. And a lot of people get in and they never come out, because the money that they're getting is so much easier than paying with their, working with their hands. So we cannot squander our money. And one of the things I notice is that if you're going to have your children learn these lessons, you yourself have to be good with money. And you have to let them know that you have to be set up for what's ahead. And we're heading to a cashless society, so it's going to be even easier to get into debt. to the point that people might even become slaves. Because that's the way it was in history. Remember history? There was people who were called sharecroppers, right? They will work and work and work, and they will have to pay off a certain amount of money to so they can buy land. And some were able to get land, but a lot of people were just so poor that they will work and work, and they will never get out of debt. There's no other comments. The only thing I have to say is that when we make a mistake, even in finances, God will not forsake us. But it's going to take a strong person with a strong faith to get out of debt. And there are people in this country that are in debt, 100,000, 200,000. And God will be able to work with that person, but that person has to give their lives to Christ and really make a strong effort on their part. Now, Monday's lesson, stewardship and instant gratification. Now, this lesson this week, do you think it was a good lesson? I think it was a good lesson. Sometimes I wonder if the people who put out this lesson are practicing what they're trying to teach here, because if you look at the spending of our leaders, paying $4-5 million for building and these institutions, they're spending so much money in these institutions, and you know, the church is not getting in any better situation. So you're spending so much money, and yet what's being produced to bring back or pay back that money, it's not. For me, it's troublesome, because things are only getting worse. But Monday's lesson is stewardship and instant gratification. And in 1 John 2:16, in 1 John 2:16 says, I'm sorry, let me just make sure 1 John 2:16, okay. I have my small Bible, so everything is smaller. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, and the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life is not of the Father, but is of this world. And stewardship and instant gratification. This is the battle. Lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh. This is why people get into trouble when it comes to instant gratification. And we know that in this world, there are many things that people want instantly. Why? Because they have to go do something to make money, right? The microwaves, the instant, you know, what is that, TV dinners, like we used to call them. You need instant food, fast food. When you wax your car, it has to be instant wax. Everything has to take work, as opposed to a time where everything was cooked, everything took time. But stewardship and instant gratification, does it work well? Instant gratification. What would be an example of instant gratification? We all have in our minds this middle-aged man in a sports car, convertible, right? That's instant gratification.
No, I don't think so.
No? Okay.
I think instant gratification, you see that old man in that sports car, and you being young, you want to be that old man at your age right there.
Yeah. Yes.
That's how I look at it.
Yes.
You know, willing to work for, you know, that long period of time, so you want it
Right.
here and now.
Right. And sometimes people get into trouble because they go into school, go into college, and they take the maximum amount, but they do other things with that money. They buy that car, or they do everything else except what they were supposed to be doing, which is going to school. And instant gratification is one of those things that a person is being controlled by their emotions and feelings. But this is not a one-time thing. Like a person goes somewhere and they say, I want that. And they say, oh, they made a decision at that point. No, this is how they've been living for a very long time. Like the example that's given with Esau. Esau, this is how he lived. And this is how he continued to live to the point where he couldn't control himself. And you see it all the time. And that's one of the reasons why they put magazines and candy when you go pay at the supermarket. Yeah, people understand the habits of people. And before they leave, the stores want to make sure that they put things in their way that's going to trip them up. And you see some people reading that magazine and put it back while they're waiting online. But you'd be surprised how many people pick up that candy or pick up that little gadgets that they have and pick up that Inquirer because at the last moment they weren't even thinking about purchasing those things. But there's something in those items that satisfy people. Chocolate. Let's think about that. A lot of people cannot resist. There's stores just that they sell chocolate. That's it. Because they know that people cannot resist chocolate. But instant gratification is something that is fostered. And if that person does not get control of that, or somebody controls that little child with instant gratification, it grows into something that's uncontrollable, to the point that they will sell their birthright, as is the example we see in Esau. Lust will normally draw us to make transactions that we normally would not do in our right state of mind. And it really takes a disciplined person to go into a dealership and come out hands-free. If they have the money, a lot of people would just get whatever they want without even thinking about it. But these decisions, even with people that have the money, it causes them to ruin. And I believe this is why God put holes into that basket, because of the sinfulness of the person, to slow down that person. And a lot of times people put in money in something that they don't need, or they're living in assets and somebody else comes and squanders it or takes it. And so we have to be stewards, and we have to be careful, because even God's people can fall into this trap. We have examples of David, right? You know that situation with Bathsheba, right? Did I say that right? Yeah, there's some questions I have about that situation. Anyway, that's a separate conversation. Like, you know, what she was doing there in the middle of the day, taking a bath. I don't know. But anyway, no, but I mean outside, like, yeah. But she never had children, right? With no, but with David, she had children. Well, he was a man of war, but anyway, he wasn't home too much, I guess. But we have situations in which God's people could get into this kind of trap, and so it is at ease, I believe, when David got caught here off guard. But we have to understand that, what is it? We sow what we reap, or we cannot gather where we did not labored. And so laboring and gathering are very interesting activities that we do at a particular time. Some people want to gather somewhere where they did not labor, and that's when we get into debt. And so this is where planning becomes very important. You do not plant in January, and you do not gather in where there's nothing to gather. And so everything has a season, and the same thing is with spending and buying. When we purchase something, we have to be careful And people really need to understand that buying is something that needs to take great care. And many companies have specific people that they go to when they need something. They need a card, they need a copier. They have people that know about purchasing. And they go through a process and they get something that's adequate for the company. Right? And so when we buy something, we just need to understand that we just have to buy something that's adequate, that's going to meet our needs. Because there's so many options out there, and there's a lot of items there that have a lot of bells and whistles that we do not need. And we have to pay a lot for it. But the lust of the flesh, like we discussed earlier, drives us to make transactions that normally we would not do in our right state of mind. And so, like Christ and Moses, we have to see afar off. If we make this purchase, how is this going to affect us for the next year? You have to calculate in your mind before you make that purchase how long it's going to take you to pay it off, and what is it you might have to cut back in order to make that money up. And then you have to make a decision, is that adequate for me? Is it going to serve me? Is it going to serve my purpose? Because if I'm not planning on working, then it doesn't make sense for me to get a car loan. Because what is a car for? To get you to point A to point B, for your errands, for work. Basically, that's why a lot of people have cars, to take their children to school. But there has to be something that the person is doing to earn the money to pay that car loan. And planning is very important. Budgeting is very important. You were going to have a comment?
We're talking about instant gratification. In doing enhancement surgery, would that be considered instant gratification?
And it depends if you're if you're into beauty pageants. If a person who perhaps is going to for a living does that kind of work, they might say, well, it's an investment because they said that I have to, look, what is that word? You have to look a certain way in order to get more jobs.
I'm asking the instant gratification part, because instant gratification we consider is never good.
No.
What we consider this now is that instant gratification.
It could be, because if you let's say you have a comment, your comment is more important. Go ahead. No, because if I make a comment, that's instant gratification. I have to hold off, because you might say something, my comment will be like, oh, okay, it doesn't make sense. Yeah.
I was going to say that when somebody does something like that, I think it has more to do with covetousness. And it could also be, it depends also on what they do. Because, for example, people do, surgery to...
The biceps?
No, to tuck something or to take away something.
Yeah.
And that can be instant gratification, because
Sure.
I do not want to do the things that I need to do to bring that down.
Yeah.
And so that's where I was going to also make another comment, that one of the reasons why instant gratification has taken over our lives is because of the same reason. We don't want to work. We don't want to work for anything. It's like, for example, I think in the lesson, the author made a comment that there's always instant reward, quick fixes, get-rich schemes,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of that has to do with, instant gratification.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons is why get-rich schemes are so popular is for the same reason. We don't want to work.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to, labor, like Brother Green said, when you see the 50-year-old man driving a very expensive car,
Mm-hmm.
he has worked like maybe 30 years, in order to make up to be in at that point in his life. A 20-year-old sees it and they want it right now, right there and then. But they don't understand that that 50-year-old, 60-year-old man has worked all those years in order to now reward himself with a car. And the same thing happens with us. You know, like, we don't want to work. We want it now. Like the same thing. Why do, frozen dinners are so popular? For the same thing. It's like, even if you want to do soup, it takes you, maybe 40 minutes to an hour to prep up to do the soup. It's like, I could just open up a can.
To do good soup. Right?
Yeah, I could just open up a can, throw it add a little bit of water, throw it in the pot. That's it.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the reasons why instant gratification has taken a hold over the people, because we don't want to work for anything. We just want to, like, immediately, it's like, give me this, give me that.
Right.
And but if we learn to work, and if we learn to, like God said, by the sweat of our brow, do the stuff, then we're also delaying gratification, so that those things do not have a hold upon us. And we can say, no, I really, I really don't need that car with all the little gadgets. Like, I could just get the bare bone, make sure that my windows
You roll down the window.
roll down the windows and save myself a few thousands of dollars. And that's where, when we have discipline, the discipline also makes us wise stewards. Otherwise, we're just spending frivolously.
Well, we know that the consequences of David were severe. He lost how many sons? 4. You know that rolling down the window. I think I'll get the power window. You know why? Because if I want to open up the back windows, I can't do it while driving. If it's good. You have a train.
They don't make it in the United States.
They don't make that anymore, right?
Not in the United States. You have to import it.
You have to import it, right? Yeah, one time I did that and the handle came off of my hand. But, but I know what you mean. You get what's necessary. You don't get the 800 horsepower. You don't get more than what you need. And you were going to make a comment.
Is there a point where we could become so frugal that it hurt us?
It can, yes, it can. But that's where learning how to spend and learning the needs comes in. I think that you can come to the point where you can just affect your life to the point that, you need to eat well, right? You need the nutrients, especially in this day and age, for you to think well. And so it doesn't make sense for you to have all this money in the bank and you're not happy. There has to be a balance in the life. And what I believe is that, in my personal experience, if you, let's say, for example, want to go to Europe, and spend all that money, then you're not going to have enough money for something else. You have to have a balance. Maybe you can do something else for vacation and still live well. But there has to be a balance. And Christ lived on this earth. And the example is here that he fasted. But Christ lived well. As far as his health was intact. He was very strong because it says that he worked. And we have to be happy with what we have too. But, surgery could be instant gratification. But I think the point that you brought up about you saving, being so frugal, can have an effect on you. I believe so too. If you want organic, you're gonna have to spend a little more, right? Or if not, plant it yourself. But if you're buying organic, then if you're cutting your TV, if you're cutting other things that you don't need, you will have money to eat well and to live well. Living within your means. What are the consequences of not living within your means? Well, we know that the consequences could be severe. We're talking about a situation where you're making good money, but yet you can't pay those bills. And so living within your means, for me, it says a lot about this topic in Proverbs, but the example is given here in Matthew 6:33, right? Seek the kingdom of heaven first, then all these things will be added onto you. And I think this economy of offerings and tithes keeping you, should I say, in check, right? Because you really have to be careful on what you spend. I met this person making 6 figures, and she was telling me that I can't make ends meet. And she told me the reason why is that she is living beyond her means. So she's telling me the problem, and at the same time, she's telling me the solution. But why is it that person won't get out of that situation? The lust of the flesh, right? The lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, right? You want these things. And so living within your means is basically, what is it you need? You need a roof over your head. You need some clothes. You need food. All these things you need. But do you need to eat 4 or 5 times a day? You just need to eat, so you can live. You don't live to eat. But there's no other comments. I think it's straightforward. Living within your means. Don't. We're living in a society that many people just want to belong to a class they shouldn't be in or cannot afford. Right? The pride of life, yes.
And I think that's where the problem is, because a lot of times we want to belong to, you may see that there are some people in your job or even in school or your classes that your classmates, your colleagues, they are probably, have more money than you do, and they're going to go out to lunch. And then after work, they're going to go out to dinner. Right. And then they're going to go for, let's say, for example, even for drinks or anything like that. Or even like during the day, like they have now these like coffee breaks, right? And they're like, we're going to go and get some coffee. Do you want to get some coffee? And then they like, before you know it, they're like going to go get coffee, 4 or 5, coffees. And you see them in the city and they're like juggling all of these coffees. And those coffees are not cheap. No. But you want to belong to that group. You want to be accepted in that group. So you go along. And you say, okay, sure, we're going, like, I think, like, there's, like, in my job, like, every day, every payday, there's a whole group that they go to, like, a buffet lunch at an Indian restaurant, and it costs, like, I think it's, like, $18 or something like that.
It went up.
So they go out, and they go, they go out to eat, and you can go out to eat every day of the week. And in the city, it's not cheap. So you're looking to spend like about $10 minimum for lunch. Then don't include breakfast. And you want to belong to that group. So you say you go along. But meanwhile, you're like, oh, I'll leave my lunch behind because, I want to go with a group. So you're going along, and before you know it, you're living beyond your means because you're desiring to be part of a group. And then you're spending money for breakfast, you're spending money for lunch, you're spending money for dinner, and that piles up. And before you know it, you're like, my little $500 paycheck is not covering my expenses that are like $800. So then what do you only are living beyond your means because you want to belong to that group, you want to be accepted. And meanwhile, you're hurting yourself. But meanwhile, when you start being satisfied with whatever it is, the life that you can live, then it's like a big burden is lifted off your shoulder because you're like not, you're spending appropriately.
Yeah, if you do this one time, well, people might say, well, it's no big deal. But if you say, for example, you eat twice a month times 12, then you times the money times 3 years, you say to yourself, wow, it's a lot of money. And so the spirit of prophecy wants us to take care of the pennies, right? And the dollars will take care of themselves. Me, I take lunch. I just take some fruits. Sometimes I even have, I have like Laura bars, or sometimes in the car, just so I don't have to go out and buy something. One, not only because it costs money, but the main reason is that sometimes I get sick when I eat out. People use MSG and they use things they should not use in the food, and it doesn't do me well. And so I prefer just to make myself some food and pack it and take it with me. And if not, then I fast. It's okay. But this is a blessing, not only because it's better for your health, but it's also good for your pocket. And so as God's people, we want to be able to sustain workers. And so if we're spending money on luxury, then when it comes down to offering, we can't give offerings to not only pay for the light, right, for certain things, but we can't pay for other things, mission trips, for example. There's certain things that we would like to do, but we can't because we're paying loans, we're paying for lifestyles that are, luxurious, and it affects us in a way more than what we know. I only have a couple minutes, right? Okay. Now, what about co-signing? Is that a good idea? Has anybody co-signed? Don't raise your hands. But sometimes you have a relative, and they want you to co-sign, and it's very difficult because I've heard of situations when people have co-signed and the person paid off. But there are other situations where people co-sign and guess what? The person doesn't pay back. So now the person has to pay their expenses, and also they have to pay somebody else's expenses. And sometimes it's not good for a person to pay off somebody else's debt, because sometimes that's not the solution. The solution is for the person to be disciplined to pay off their own debt. If you pay that person's debt, what's going to happen sooner or later? That person is going to get back into debt. Because why they got into debt in the first place? It's the same reason why they're going to get to debt in the second place. So you can pay off the debt again, and guess what's going to happen again? Because the person, that's just how they function. This is how they live. And so we have to be careful in how we help people. Sometimes we can help people by relieving them, right? But they still need to understand that they have to learn how to handle their money. Because why did they get into debt in the first place? Why was it out of control? But yes.
And I was going to say that's why, there is the the bankruptcy rules. They're there for a purpose, but a lot of people utilize them as a means to be able to hit the restart button.
Right.
But what happens is that they're not helping themselves because, like you said, the same reason why they got into uncontrollable debt is because they didn't have discipline. So then they hit the restart button and they file for bankruptcy, and then they end up again in the same place. Like I've known people that they file for bankruptcy 2 or 3 times already, and they're just in their 50s, And but that's what happens. It's when God made provisions, and He said that once after 7 years, the debt was supposed to be forgiven. But it wasn't because it was more so because of the bondage issue. So the person wouldn't have that burden. But it wasn't to like say like, okay, you could start fresh all over again. And now you go ahead, you can get back into debt. And that's the problem, that it's not, that it's not taught, the discipline. And when if in any time we come to the rescue of somebody, the person is not learning the lesson.
Right.
And that's there was always object lessons and everything that God did for us. And it was supposed to be for that purpose, that we learned the mistakes that we made. I mean, learn from the mistakes that we made so that we won't do them again, but not to go and continue to stay, get into debt. And that's why it's so important to be able to be disciplined in every aspect of our lives.
When Christ fed the multitude, right, from bread and fish, there were 12 baskets of fragments that were left over, and Christ performed this miracle. And so some people may say it didn't cost money, but still, Christ is trying to teach us not to squander the blessings that we have. And so those 12 fragments, those people took back with them and shared those fragments with those that were not there, and try to teach them a lesson. And so when we look at what we have, it doesn't matter what we have. Somebody had to pay for it if we didn't pay for it. And we have to be careful not to squander what means we have. We have to take care of the things that we have. It doesn't matter what it is, because that is part of our assets, and we have to be stewards. And so there's so much that we can talk about. But it says here, every natural ability, skill, or gift comes from God, whether we be born genetically with it, influenced, and educated by our environment, or both. The important part of the equation is that what we do with the abilities and skills we have. And so that's also part of the lesson. God expects stewards to learn to be masters of their skills and ability through education and practical experience. And so many times these abilities are not developed, and children grow up and they don't have a knowledge of how to spend money and the principles of how to be stewards of all the things that they have. And they get into debt and they borrow, and they get into trouble. And so we know that whatever happens to one person in the family or in the church, it affects many. So we thank you so much. I'll turn it over to Sister Tamara, and join us again later on as we do divine service.
Thank you, Elder Otero, for leading the lesson this morning, and thank you, everyone, for your comments. Very, very interesting lesson. I have to admit this, even though the quarter's on stewardship, I can't say that I really expected this type of lesson, especially how direct it was to be in the quarterly, but it was, and I think it was a good subject for us to study this week. So we studied debt, daily decision, and some of the themes that were touched upon was, especially during the study this morning, was the fact that we have to be conscious of what we're borrowing money for, and we need to make sure that we live within our means, and that we make choices that we don't keep running ourselves over and over and over again into debt. So for the closing reading, I'd like to share a short reading from Counsels on Stewardship, just to solidify the points that were made this morning during the study. Again, this is Counsels on Stewardship, page 255, and it reads, "The practice of borrowing money to relieve some pressing necessity and making no calculation for canceling the indebtedness, however common, is demoralizing. The Lord would have all who believe the truth converted from these self-deceiving practices. They should choose rather to suffer want than to commit a dishonest act. No soul can resort to prevarication or dishonesty in handling the Lord's goods and stand guiltless before God. All who do this deny Christ in action, while they profess to keep and teach the commandments of God. They do not maintain the principles of God's laws. If those who see the truth do not change in character corresponding to the sanctifying influence of the truth, they will be a savor of death unto death. They will misrepresent the truth, being a reproach upon it, and dishonor Christ, who is truth. Be determined never to incur another debt. Deny yourself 1,000 things rather than run in debt. This has been the curse of your life, getting into debt. Avoid it as you would the smallpox. Make a solemn covenant with God that by his blessing you will pay your debts and then owe no man anything if you live on porridge and bread. So she's basically saying it's better for you to live on porridge, or we'll say oatmeal and bread, than to, if that's what it takes, it's better to do that and get out of debt than to do otherwise. It is so easy in preparing your table to throw out of your pocket 25 cents for extras. Take care of the pennies, and the dollars will take care of themselves. It is the mites here and there that are spent for this, that, and the other that soon run up into dollars. Deny self at least while you are walled in with debts. Do not falter, be discouraged, or turn back. Deny your taste, deny the indulgence of appetite. Save your pence and pay your debts. Work them off as fast as possible. When you can stand forth a free man again, owing no man anything, you will have achieved a great victory. The latter part of what I read was actually a letter that was written to a specific person. And though the time was different and money was denominated in pence and mites and things like that, the same issue exists today. Watch your pennies, including the children. When you get money, you need to make sure that whatever you're buying is something that you need. And you should start keeping a list of what you spent your money on. Even if you bought a pencil, you should write down pencil, the date, and how much you spent on it. Because the more you get into the habit of keeping track of your money now and noticing how you're spending it, when you become adults, you'll be much more prepared to handle your finances and handle your life and keep yourself out of debt. And even though the rest of us might not be children anymore, it's not too late for us to practice the same economy. I'm not saying that we should all turn into misers, because there's, that's the other extreme of going into debt, becoming so miserly with money that you basically live an austere life that punishes yourself and everyone around you. But that doesn't stop us from being careful with the Lord's means and being mindful of how we spend the money. So if there's patterns that we see, we can correct that and help ourselves out of debt. And by helping ourselves, we can help someone else, because what greater testimony is it than to tell someone, you know what, I was in debt just like you, but this is how I got out. There's no more powerful sermon than that you can preach when you say to someone, I know exactly what situation you're in, and this is how I got out of it. And this is why I thank the Lord for this church and for practical religion, because at least we're enhanced not just for eternity, but for life right now. Because before we get to heaven, we still have to deal with the life here now. And we can either make it a heavenly experience on earth, or we can make it a hell on earth. So let us strive to do what we can, that we'll be careful with the Lord's means, that we can be a blessing to others around us. We'll turn to our closing hymn, which would be number 590. Trust and Obey, number 590. Number 590. And when it is found, I'll ask that you please stand. Number 590.
He
trust and obey. Last stanza. Then in fellowship sweet we will sit at his feet, or we'll walk by his side in the way. What he says we will do, where he sends we will go. Never fear, only trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. Let us reverently kneel for our closing prayer.
Dear kind, righteous Father, Lord, as we just sang trust and obey, let us trust you, Lord, and trust your word, and be obedient to these things, because truly, Lord, as we've studied in the lesson this morning, when we're in debt, it is difficult for us to serve thee aright. It's difficult, Lord, to even exist. So I ask that you might strengthen each one of us here and online, that we will take heart the things that we studied this morning, we will apply them to ourselves, and that we will do whatever it is we need to do to help ourselves out of debt. And not just for the bragging right of saying that we're out of debt, but that we can open our hand to help others by teaching them the things that we learned, and by also extending benevolence to those who are in need around us. These are many blessings I ask in your Son's name. Amen. We will now have a short break. We will resume at 11:30. You are dismissed from Sabbath School.